Hey guys, let's get more news about Steelers, but before that, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like. Steelers insiders anticipate original round restricted tender for Jaylen Warren, not second round. With the restricted status of Jaylen Warren, the Steelers actually have two running backs hitting free agency. Obviously, they hold considerably more control over Warren than they do Najee Harris, but they have decisions to make. In particular, they must decide which restricted tender to put on him. For most of the past year, the prevailing wisdom was that they would use a second-round tender on Warren. As a former college free agent, the Steelers would not be entitled to any draft compensation should they choose not to match any offer sheet he was to sign with another team. But they would still hold the right of first refusal, eligible to match any offer. And that seems to be the route they intend to take, as multiple reporters have recently intimated. Warren is a restricted free agent, which means the Steelers are likely to tender him a right of first refusal offer that will cost them only $3.18 million in 2025, wrote Jerry Dulac of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Similarly, colleague Ray Fittipaldo mused on the North Shore Drive podcast that they will probably give him an original round tender. In recent weeks, I myself came around to the idea of the Steelers only using an original round tender on Jaylen Warren. Especially coming off his unremarkable season, I don't think there is a great threat of another team signing him to an unreasonable contract. The worst-case scenario is likely another team simply doing the Steelers' contract negotiations for them. You see, the projected contract cost between the two tags is not insignificant. Over the Cap projects a right of first refusal tender value of $3,185,000. In contrast, tagging Jaylen Warren at the second-round level would cost the Steelers $5,217,000. Now, $2 million is not an exorbitant sum if it's the difference between retaining or losing your primary running back. And many expect the Steelers to let Najee Harris go and move forward with Warren. But one has to consider the risk versus the money. How much would another team be willing to sign Warren to, especially with a robust running back draft class? As much as Steelers fans love Warren, we're not talking Pro Bowls here. Over 3 years, he has 1,674 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns on 346 carries. He also has 894 receiving yards on 127 receptions, but added no more touchdowns. Yes, his sample size is low for a 3-year career, but it's also a projection that he could produce at a similarly efficient level with a greater workload. After the 2023 season, you had defenders and opposing teams talking about Jaylen Warren as a guy they prepared for when playing the Steelers. While he didn't have a bad season, certainly one marred by injury, though, that reputation has subsided. I just don't think there are going to be many teams who would even consider putting together an offer sheet. It's uncommon for teams to do that for restricted agents, generally, in part because there's too great a risk of no reward for a considerable amount of work. Maybe if there's a team that really sees Jaylen Warren as perfectly fitting their philosophy. But otherwise, I don't think the Steelers have much to worry about. Report: Bengals intend to sign T. Higgins and Trey Hendrickson to long-term deals. Both W.R.T. Higgins and D.E. Trey Hendrickson requested trades from the Cincinnati Bengals last year. They intend to do everything in their power this year to avoid that, and more. Higgins is a pending free agent, while Hendrickson is in the final year of his contract. While it is not clear they can accomplish their task, they mean to sign both to long-term deals. Hendrickson, who led the NFL in sacks in 2024, has already hinted at another trade request. While he said his preference was to remain with the Bengals, he understands the salary cap pie has limits. Higgins initially requested a trade last year under the franchise tag. However, once the reality of the situation set in, he played the good soldier and teammate. The team will attempt to secure a trio of stars who need new deals, wide receivers Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins and defensive end Trey Hendrickson, for the long term. Jeremy Fowler reported for ESPN about the Bengals' plans. Whether Cincinnati can pull it off remains uncertain, but the team's messaging behind the scenes is that it's certainly going to try. On Monday, Sports Illustrated's James Rapien reported that the Bengals intend to franchise tag Higgins. However, that is only a stepping stone toward working to complete a long-term deal. A second franchise tag would pay Higgins north of $26 million this year, which is no longer unreasonable for receivers. As for Hendrickson, his market is becoming hard to ignore with 35 sacks over the past 2 years. For some reason, the Bengals' edge rusher seems to go somewhat overlooked as a second-tier player. Regardless of how one views him, he has the production, and there's a market for that. In 2023, the Bengals signed Hendrickson to a 1-year extension worth $21 million. That salary places him outside of the top 10 at his position, which is increasingly hard to justify. It will be interesting to see how high up the salary chain the Bengals are willing to go, though. And the Bengals will have to have the same discussion with T. Higgins, of course. How high can they raise his salary in the same year they give Ja'Marr Chase the largest non-quarterback contract in NFL history? Because that is very likely to happen. Chase is the top priority, behind Joe Burrow, and has been since the day they drafted him. But some have argued that paying players like Higgins and Hendrickson is an extension of the Bengals' top priorities. By opening their wallets, they are showing Burrow and Chase their commitment to winning. And for the Bengals, that has been a concern for a long time under owner Mike Brown. After all, this is a roster that has been on the precipice. They have been minutes away from winning the Super Bowl. And they also saw how even Patrick Mahomes is mortal, not that they haven't beaten the Chiefs. But the Bengals are in win-now mode, as in 2025. And keeping T. Higgins and Trey Hendrickson would definitely contribute to that cause for the next few years. Pittsburgh Steelers named landing spot for superstar former Penn State wide receiver. Could the Pittsburgh Steelers offense start to turn into a Penn State party? Already having tight Pat Freiermuth, the Steelers need talent on offense, and there is one candidate that would make a lot of sense. That would be Tampa Bay's Chris Godwin, who is now the top receiver on the market after T. Higgins was franchise tagged by the Cincinnati Bengals. The 33rd team's Tyler Brook sees the Steelers as an ideal fit for both sides. Godwin could land a huge contract in free agency, and the Steelers would land a true top wide receiver. That's not talking about Pittsburgh's quarterback situation, but pairing Godwin with a deep threat outside receiver, Brook wrote. George Pickens thrives in those situations, but the lack of firepower on the rest of the Steelers' offense has allowed opponents to shut down their number one option, leading to frustration and a lack of explosive plays and points on the board. Godwin suffered a dislocated ankle that ended his season. Before that, Godwin was on pace to have a career year with the Buccaneers, lighting the world on fire with 576 yards and 5 touchdowns in just 7 games. The question will be if Godwin can reach his pre-injury form, but as long as he can, the Steelers would be wise to check in and at least pursue the superstar wide receiver. And you, fan? What do you think of Chris Godwin's situation? Leave your opinion in the comments.